Hi everyone, JUSTPADRIDE Snowboard channel here with the last part of my three-part series on stances. So far I've been talking about duck stances, various ones. Definition for me of a duck stance is basically anything where your back foot toes are pointing towards the tail. And the most extreme out of them is like the symmetrical setup where you're matching back foot and front foot, as in 12 degrees, minus 12 degrees. And I kind of try to point out that that is really an extreme on the whole spectrum of possible riding stances. So today we're going to look into all the things that change and all the things that you have to change if you decide to put on a stance where your back foot crosses the magic 0 degree line and makes your toes point forward towards the nose. First of all, I want to say that I don't think a double positive setup is a good setup for beginners. And that has everything to do with the speed you're riding at and the momentum you produce through your turn. So basically, as a beginner, you're not going to be riding very fast, right? At least not if you're trying to stay in control. So at slower speeds, the efficient way to steer your board is through your feet using the board's torsional flex. And that works through knee and ankle movement that basically ends up directing pressure through the soles of your feet to the edges, helping you steer your board like so. That is obviously very efficient when you consider the torque you have when your feet are, or your bindings are mounted somewhat like pointing your feet across the board, right? There's a lot of leverage going on here. Now, as we leave this plane and go double positive and keep making the same movement, like ankle and knee movement, you will find that this now starts to get less and less pressure to the edge because it's more of a fore-aft movement. Obviously, that depends on the angles. I personally think when I go past +9 or +12 degrees on my back foot, like if I go +15, I can clearly feel how these micro movements with the attempt of torsional steering don't have that much of an effect anymore, and therewith make for a ride that is more challenging at slower speeds. What happens when you put yourself into this position? Because one of the most important parts in snowboarding is that your center of mass, your hips, has to cross the board in order for you to get on edge. So where before you were able to do this way, right? Like drop your knees, the hip follows, you're on your edge, and here you do the same thing, and that's how you get your hip across the board and over the edge. Now, as you go into a more double positive type stance, the knee and ankle movement, as I said earlier, become more of a fore-aft movement and don't bring that much mass across the board. So what do you have to do? If you go up the chain of joints, that gets you to your hips next. And that means you have to actually work with the hips. So in order for me to get onto my toe edge, I can't just do this. I have to bring in my hips as well and bend here, right? So same thing goes for the heel edge. I do this. It's kind of this movement. And because this is a fairly large mass and I have a long lever from the ground to the hip, I can't just throw this mass into the turns at slow speeds or the slow speeds that I'm riding at as a beginner. Hence, the double positive kind of setup lends itself much better to somebody who is already riding quite fluently and can carry a reasonable amount of momentum like through the turns and can then make use of all the positive aspects of a double positive stance. Of course, double positive stances are also on a bit of a spectrum. So you can really crank it and go into like race mode with like 50 degrees and more on your front foot. Or you can simply dabble with, you know, just +3 on the back foot and 24 in the front, however you want to set it up. The importance here to note is that the more aggressive you go, the less effect on edge change are your ankles and knees going to have, and the more you will have to work solely from your hips. Your ankles and knees will always be responsible for vertical movement, like weighting and unweighting the board vertically. But the more aggressively forward you go, the more you will solely be relying on crossing your hips, kind of in the manner of a pendulum. And that's super cool, but the downside of that is, since this is a great mass that is fairly high up with a long lever, this movement is a slow movement. So what I do, for example, I always ride double positive no matter what. And what I do when I know that I'm going to be riding more technical terrain or tighter terrain, or, you know, on a big power day, I know after an hour and a half our hill is probably tracked, but I still want to ride. So I'm encountering a lot of bumps that require more finesse, more small movements. So what I do for those kinds of scenarios is I simply dial it back. I will probably be rocking a 3 or 6 degree positive on my back foot. That simply allows me to still very quickly direct pressure across the board and work with the torsional flex of the board again. Setup wise, I'd say when you start out and you don't really know where the journey is going, you're interested in all sides of snowboarding, go with some -6 on the back foot and somewhat around 18 or so on the front, or -3 and 18 or whatever. Point your back foot a little backwards. It'll give you all the power you need to actually make these torsional little micro movements. If you already know that you're not interested in any freestyle or riding switch or park or whatever, and you really are committed to be this directional rider and your highest goal is like amazing carving turns, then maybe start out with your back foot at 0. I would not suggest to go full on posi as a beginner. The back foot at 0 will already open your hips a bit more, and you still have good power and torque through your back foot, which is actually optimal, like it points straight across the board. And I think that would be a good setup if you already know that you are totally a directional rider and you're just starting out. Alright, so I'm going to try to focus on 3 points that are all super important for any kind of turning with any kind of binding setup. And I will then try to explain why at an advanced level of riding with more speed and higher board angulation, these 3 points can be executed much more efficiently in a double positive binding setup. So I already mentioned point 1, and that is basically that your center of mass, no matter how you're set up, always has to travel across the board in order for you to get that board on edge. And your center of mass is your hips. This ties directly into the second point that is super important. You always want to keep your center of mass stacked over the edge most efficiently at any given board angulation throughout the turn. So that's a bit of a game you're playing with your weight, the forces that work against you or with you, however, throughout a turn as you increase angulation and speed and momentum. It's pretty fun to play with, but this staying stacked over the edge is super, super important for optimal grip. And those two things go together. Let's have a look what happens in a duck stance. So here I am in my duck stance, and I'm trying to move my hip across the board, and I'm starting all this with ankles and knees, and here I am on my toe edge. Now, if I want to increase board angulation, I have to start leaning into the turn, right? Like there's a point, I can't just do this and expect the forces not to completely bend me in half. At some point, my upper body has to also lean into the turn and move into the turn. The issue there is that my chest is quite a big mass. So if I just do this, and now I just fall forward into the turn, there's a very good chance that two things happen. One is it's too much mass and I simply can't hold myself there. And two is that the board will ride away underneath me because I don't have much weight in the front. I'm going to get to that in a minute here. What happens on your heel edge in a duck stance is basically that, first of all, the length of your femur automatically, when you squat like this, puts your center of mass way behind your edge, right? So to a degree, you can counter that with your upper body by doing like this. You come a little forward here and you drop a little further down there. And that's okay if you don't apply too much angulation. So as soon as you want to really crank that board on edge, the same two things happen as on the toe edge. Your center of mass is going to be too heavy and will simply drag you down unless you counter the movement up here. But if you counter the movement up here and hinge forward, you can't also be in the front. That doesn't really work very well. So the board is going to ride away from underneath you, or you simply fall onto your butt. Let's look at those two turns, heel toe, in a double positive setup. So if I'm standing like this, first thing to note, when I squat in this position, my butt does not move ways away from my edge. I'm actually staying over the edge. It's kind of like a cat ready to attack. So that's positive. I'm more over the board in this position, right? I'm actually pretty neutral, where in a duck stance, I'm not very neutral at all. I already have to counter, bring my chest forward. So here I am, I can squat, and I'm nicely balanced and centered with butt stacking over the heel edge. And if I want to get on my toes from here, and I mentioned this earlier, arms are out here, I can basically work with my hip, and my upper body doesn't move into the turn at all. I'm only dropping my hip into the turn, right? So at this point, the position is actually quite hard on the body if you do it right. At this point, you can simply keep going like this and increase edge angulation. And you will see that this is an interesting one for all the Euro carvers out there. You will see that your front arm actually drops while your rear arm lifts. So this idea of I'm Euro carving because I have a hand in the snow, that's unfortunately nonsense. You want to do the opposite. You move your back arm away from the snow. And because of your overall angulation and you're stretching out, you're pushing with the hip into the turn, you eventually get that hand in the snow because the slope simply gets in the way. You're not ever reaching, if you find yourself reaching down for the snow with your back hand, you're already in an entirely wrong position. Unfortunate truth today, sorry. On your heel edge, same story goes. My butt is over the edge, so when I squat, I actually don't fall over. And I can keep my chest in a more neutral position. I don't have to counter this butt weight by coming forward. I can simply stay here, and same thing goes. Front hand goes up, back hand comes down. And I can drop my hip into the turn while keeping my chest more over the board. So I'm much better stacked, and I can get my board way higher on edge before either my knee hits the snow or my butt hits the snow on the heel edge. So I have way more freedom for higher edge angles, and I'm much less twisted, more open, and technically in a much more neutral position. The third point I mentioned to you guys was keeping pressure in the front of your board. So that's an important thing for anything. You need front foot pressure to enter a turn. And now what happens as you ride faster, as you enter the fall line more aggressively, is that it happens quite easily that the board gets away from underneath you because you don't manage to keep the pressure in the front. And to get the pressure there, in a duck stance you can't really do that much, because this is not very helpful, because you do need some pressure on your back foot as well. You can't just absorb everything only here, and you're riding sideways and you don't see anything. We've talked about all of this. So it's not very helpful. The real helpful thing is getting your chest over the board, but now over the nose. If I flex forward from the hips in my duck stance, my chest simply moves to the inside of my toe turn. It doesn't help me. As soon as I move forward like this into a more open position, I'm all of a sudden literally adding a joint for fore-aft movement, and that is my hip joint. So I can now move on all planes here. I can basically use ankles and knees and hips for directing pressure across the board, going from edge to edge, and I can use my hip and my chest to move into the nose, or maybe move back. However, like I have range of motion in every direction that I didn't really have before, or that, let's say, was much harder for me to engage with. So for an aggressive toe turn, for example, I can now basically out of my forward stance, and I'm free to move in every direction, I can get into a super efficient position by moving forward from the hip, then moving my knees and my hips to the inside of the turn, while I'm basically reaching with my front hand for my front heel. So, and as I said earlier, this will automatically move my backhand away from the snow, which most people these days are trying to reach for the snow with their backhand because Euro carving. So forget about that. Drop your front hand to the front heel and lift this shoulder by pinching your outside hip. That's the inside of your turn. This is my outside hip. I'm pinching that to move my hip into the turn. So that is a very, very efficient movement with a lot of pressure in the nose. So my board can't ever get away from underneath me, and I'm always leading with my chest. This same advantage is much more dramatic on the heel edge even. If you think of yourself in that duck stance and you want to open up, first of all, your toes, your back foot toes pointing backwards are blocking your hip, right? You cannot come forward enough here to comfortably flex forward from the hip and to stay somewhat aligned in a comfortable position. You're blocking your hip into this squat and you can't really move it around much. So looking from the front, positive stance, what I have now is, as I said earlier, my butt is actually over my heel edge. That's great. And I can do the same thing, right? Like I move my hip into the turn, and again, inside of the turn, outside of the turn, I am pinching my outside hip. So right here, I do this, right? I drop my back shoulder in this case, and I lift my front shoulder. So that's the opposite when you go heel to toe. And that keeps my big heavy chest out of the turn. I can basically keep this stacked like so. And that's pretty awkward, but it's very efficient. I recommend doing some yoga for these kinds of things. There's another pretty interesting realization that's going to come up as you practice this. The pressure going along the edge from front foot to back foot is a little different throughout the turn when you are riding in a double positive stance. If you think of my back hip being obviously attached to my back leg, and that is my toe turn right here, the back hip moves into the turn, then you can imagine that there's naturally more pressure on that back foot, and you still need the front foot pressure to enter the turn. But from my personal perception, I would say on your toe edge, the pressure moves to your back foot earlier than it does on your heel edge. On the heel edge, I carry more pressure on my front foot for longer throughout the turn. And I think that is because front hip attaches to front leg, and naturally when I drop this has more pressure than this. So I might be wrong with this. Please comment if you're a race coach and you can help me out here. This is my own perception. I am on my front foot longer in my heel turn than in my toe turn. I get more power out of that kind of pressure distribution. The main takeaway, however, is that it is way easier to play with all this fore aft and the amounts of angulation when you are actually taking in this kind of position in that moderate forward stance. I'm not talking, putting 50 degrees on your front foot. The most I ride is on a narrower board is about 36 degrees on the front foot. That is pretty wild in soft boot world. I think that is also the point where soft boots start becoming actually laterally too soft, because as I increase my front foot angle, I will do more of this, right? Like pushing to the heel edge in the heel turn with my knee, and that requires more lateral stiffness than a soft boot can give me. This is also where high back rotation is so important. You want to bring your high back as far around as you can, or buy a binding with a very curved high back that gives you something to lean into right here on the outside. So the rabbit hole of turning, carving and double positive is pretty darn deep, and I think we just about scratched the surface here. There's a quote I once read that I think is just beautiful. It says, "The turn, the first thing you learn, the last thing you master." I think that's completely hitting the point there. And the biggest takeaway I hope for you here is that solely changing your stance to double positive is not gonna do the trick to become a better turner or carver. You will have to look at how you're using your body in that position. I'm gonna put myself out here. My standpoint on this is that riding in a duck stance and riding in a double positive stance, literally that's two different techniques, and I would actually appreciate it if snowboard schools around the world started to teach that way again. That once you've passed the beginner phase where you're linking turns fluently, that you're being offered to go down more of an all-round type path with more freestyle, or more of a like turns inspired, carving inspired path, where they do then put you into a more positive, more open setup and teach you these things with your hips and with this whole hinging forward and what the upper body does in regards to hands in the snow. I think that would be absolutely fantastic to see out there. Snowboarding can be whatever you want it to be. And I believe that for the reasons I gave in this episode, the turn side of riding, the carving side of riding is more fun and more efficient and more dynamic in a double positive stance. If you completely disagree with everything I just said, or you think it didn't make sense to you, or it's nonsense altogether, please engage in the comments. I'm a giant nerd about this topic. I literally tap into turns zone in the winter. It's my meditation, my daily practice. And I absolutely love talking about it, and I also love exchanging ideas about it. I think personally I'm still learning. Kind of every winter there's something where I feel like, whoa, this is better now. And that's pretty cool. So it tells you how long that journey of perfecting your turns can really be. It's kind of a lifetime. So yeah, I've been getting lots of love from you guys over the last weeks here. Lots of nice comments or private messages that tell me that I might be on the right track here, really putting out some useful content, some useful knowledge that helps to dial in your gear or to improve your riding, whatever it is. And yeah, I'm hoping you enjoyed what you heard today. Please stay tuned, there's more to come. Subscribe, like the channel, share the content, get notifications for whatever drops next, and most importantly, keep carving. See you out there. Peace.